temperature is somewhere around -7 degrees Celsius. The wind chill would be brutal. The rain is coming down in sheets. And sometime around 8:13 p.m. on the night before Thanksgiving, 1971, a man in a business suit steps off the back stairs of a moving Boeing 727 and disappears into the darkness. The pilots feel a slight bump, a change in pressure. That's it. When the plane lands in Reno at 10:15 p.m., FBI agents swarm the aircraft. They find the rear air stair still open. They find his black clip-on tie on seat 18C. They find 2 of the 4 parachutes. He had taken only 2 with him. They find cigarette butts. They find fingerprints, or what they think are fingerprints. But they do not find Dan Cooper. They do not find $200,000. They do not find a parachute in the trees below. They do not find a body. Dan Cooper had jumped into one of the most remote, densely forested, brutally cold stretches of wilderness in the Pacific Northwest and simply ceased to exist. The FBI opened the case immediately. They called it NORJAC, Northwest Hijacking, and what followed was one of the most exhaustive, most expensive, most frustrating investigations in the history of American law enforcement. Let's talk about what they knew and what they didn't. What they knew: a man calling himself Dan Cooper had hijacked Northwest Orient Flight 305. He had collected $200,000 in marked $20 bills. He had parachuted somewhere over a 25-mile stretch of terrain between Seattle and Reno, specifically, most likely, over the area around Ariel, Washington, a tiny town near the Columbia River, surrounded by dense forest, volcanic ridgelines, and near impossible terrain. What they didn't know, literally everything else. They didn't know his real name. Dan Cooper was an alias, and oddly the name D.B. Cooper actually came from a mistake. In the early hours after the hijacking, a reporter confused the suspect with a different man named D.B. Cooper, who had been briefly questioned and cleared. The name D.B. Cooper stuck. It became legend, but it was never the name he gave. They didn't know his face. The composite sketches made from witness descriptions show a man who looks like, well, a lot of people. A middle-aged white man, lean build, dark hair, maybe 5'10", somewhere between 40 and 50 years old. The descriptions were consistent enough to narrow it down to roughly a few million American men. They didn't know where exactly he jumped. The pilots had been told to fly at 10,000 feet with flaps at 15 degrees at the slowest safe speed, about 150 knots. But the exact moment of the jump was unclear. The air stair indicator light flickering at 8:13 p.m. gave them a rough window, but the exact coordinates, unknown. They searched anyway. Within days, hundreds of soldiers, law enforcement officers, and volunteers combed the forests of southwestern Washington. They found nothing. Not a parachute, not a scrap of the money bag, not a footprint, not a bone. The terrain made it nearly impossible. The Cascade foothills in that region are covered in old-growth Douglas fir, steep ravines, and dense undergrowth. In late November, with snow starting to fall, searching those woods was like looking for a needle in the world's most hostile haystack. And here is what made investigators increasingly uncomfortable as the weeks turned to months. There was no body.
In survival terms, what D.B. Cooper had done was almost suicidal. He jumped at night in a rainstorm in near-freezing temperatures, wearing a business suit and loafers, not cold-weather gear. He had no helmet, no altimeter, no night vision equipment. The 2 parachutes he took with him, investigators later realized with horror, one of them was a training chute. It wasn't designed to be steerable. It was a dummy chute used to train student skydivers. Either he didn't know that, or he didn't care. If he had survived the jump, he would have landed in some of the most remote terrain in Washington state, in the dark, in the rain, with no maps, no survival gear, and $200,000 in cash that he couldn't exactly spend at a tree stump. Most experts said he didn't survive, but most experts also couldn't explain why there was no body, and so the FBI kept the case open, and the years started to pass. Over the next 4 decades, the FBI would formally investigate more than 1,000 suspects. More than 1,000 people were at one point or another considered a possible match for D.B. Cooper. Some were turned in by family members, some turned themselves in. Some were identified by investigators following paper trails, military records, and circumstantial evidence. Let me walk you through the most compelling ones. First, Richard Floyd Jr. Jr. 4 months after the D.B. Cooper hijacking, in April 1972, a man named Richard McCoy hijacked a United Airlines flight and parachuted out with $500,000. The similarities were startling. McCoy was a former Army paratrooper and Green Beret. He knew how to jump. He was meticulous, calm, and detail-oriented during the hijacking, just like Cooper had been. He was caught relatively quickly because he was, frankly, not as careful afterward. FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach, who spent years working the Cooper case, was convinced McCoy was Cooper. The age matched, the build matched, the parachute skills matched, the modus operandi matched almost perfectly. But the FBI officially ruled McCoy out. Witnesses from Flight 305 said Cooper looked older than McCoy, who was 29 at the time. McCoy's wife provided an alibi, and McCoy himself denied it until the day he died, which came in 1974 when he was killed in a shootout with FBI agents after escaping from prison. So McCoy is out officially. Second, Duane Weber. In 1995, a woman named Jo Weber came forward with a stunning claim. Her late husband, Duane, who had died earlier that year, had confessed to her on his deathbed. He had said quietly, "I'm Dan Cooper." Jo Weber went to the FBI. She brought what evidence she had. Duane Weber was a small-time criminal with a record of theft and forgery. He had served time in federal prison. He matched the physical description roughly, and investigators found that Duane Weber had in his past visited the exact area of Washington state where Cooper was believed to have landed. The FBI investigated. They tested DNA from Duane Weber against DNA recovered from Cooper's clip-on tie. The results were inconclusive, not a match, but not definitively ruled out either. The case against Duane Weber remained circumstantial. Jo Weber believed until her death that her husband was D.B. Cooper. The FBI was less convinced. Third, L.D. Cooper. In 2011, a woman named Marla Cooper came forward claiming that her uncle, a man named L.D. Cooper, was the hijacker. She said she remembered as a child her uncle arriving at their family's home the day after Thanksgiving 1971, bloodied and injured, claiming he had been in a car accident. She said she had overheard her uncle and her father talking about having done it, having pulled off the hijacking.
The FBI took this seriously. They tested DNA from a guitar strap belonging to L.D. Cooper. Again, inconclusive. L.D. Cooper had died in 1999. Without a definitive DNA match, the FBI couldn't close the case. Fourth, Robert Rackstraw. This one is perhaps the most compelling modern candidate, and the one that most recently dominated headlines.
Robert Rackstraw was a military veteran with airborne training, a criminal record that included theft, fraud, and weapons charges, and a history of using false identities. He had the skills, he had the temperament, he had the background. In 2016, a private team of investigators, led by a man named Thomas Colbert, claimed they had decoded secret messages hidden in letters sent to newspapers by someone claiming to be D.B. Cooper in the 1970s. Those messages, they said, pointed directly to Rackstraw and contained coded references to his military unit. Rackstraw denied everything. The FBI examined the coded message theory and did not find it credible enough to reopen the case. Rackstraw died in 2019, still publicly denying he was D.B. Cooper, with no definitive evidence either way. And so the list goes on. Hundreds of names, hundreds of theories, none of them proven, none of them definitively ruled out. Now, let's talk about the one piece of physical evidence that actually showed up. February 10th, 1980, 8 years after the hijacking, a boy named Brian Ingram is on a family camping trip along the banks of the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. He's digging in the sandy riverbank, and he pulls up something unexpected, a rotting packet of $20 bills, then another, then another. In total, Brian Ingram finds 3 packets, 294 bills in total, partially decomposed, rubber-banded together, buried in the sand. The FBI checks the serial numbers. They match. These are D.B. Cooper's bills. And that discovery, instead of solving the mystery, makes it deeper. Here's why. The location where the money was found, Tina Bar along the Columbia River, is not where experts believed Cooper had landed. It's downstream, yes, but in a way that doesn't quite make sense given the geography and the river's current patterns over the years. The money had been in the water or near the water for years, but how it got there and from where, nobody could say for certain. There were theories. One theory said the money had been buried by Cooper himself after a rough landing somewhere upstream and then gradually washed down over the years. Another theory said the money had never been carried by Cooper at all, that it had somehow been discarded or lost near the river separately from the jump. Another, darker theory said Cooper had landed in the Columbia River itself and drowned, and the money had eventually washed ashore. Investigators brought in experts in river hydrology. They tried to map the currents. They tried to figure out where a bundle of bills would have to enter the river to end up at Tina Bar in the condition Brian Ingram found them. They couldn't agree on an answer.
The remaining $194,000, the vast majority of the hijacking money, has never been found. Not in a bank account, not in a dead man's wallet, not buried in someone's backyard, nowhere. And here is the truly haunting detail. If D.B. Cooper had survived, if he had successfully laundered and spent that money over the years, the marked serial numbers would almost certainly have shown up somewhere in the banking system. The FBI was watching for them. Banks were watching for them. In over 50 years, not a single bill beyond those 294 has ever surfaced in circulation. Either D.B. Cooper never spent the money, or D.B. Cooper never survived to spend it. So what actually happened?
There are three dominant theories, and each one has serious people behind it. Theory 1. He died in the jump. This is what most FBI agents who worked the case believed. The conditions were simply too brutal. A business suit is not a jumpsuit. Loafers are not jump boots. The training chute he accidentally took was difficult to control. At night, in a rainstorm over dense old-growth forest, without an altimeter to tell him how close the ground was, the odds of surviving that jump was very low. Under this theory, D.B. Cooper's body landed somewhere in the forests of southwestern Washington and was simply never found. The wilderness there is vast and extraordinarily difficult to search. Bodies have been lost in those forests for decades. The money found at Tennebar washed there from wherever he landed near a tributary of the Columbia. This is the clean theory, the tidy one. But it requires believing that in 50 years, not a single hiker, hunter, logger, or search party has stumbled across so much as a bone. Theory 2. He survived and lived out his life anonymously. Under this theory, D.B. Cooper was a trained professional, ex-military, possibly special forces, who knew exactly what he was doing. He knew the 727's rear air stare. He knew how to jump. He knew how to disappear. He had a plan. Under this theory, he landed successfully, buried or disposed of the bulk of the money because he knew it was marked, kept enough to get started, and simply walked back into ordinary American life under a new identity. This theory explains why nobody was ever found. It explains why only a small portion of the money turned up. It is thrilling because it means somewhere in America, possibly for decades, there was a man living a completely normal life who always knew that he was D.B. Cooper. The problem with this theory is the money. If he survived and lived for any length of time, why did none of the marked bills ever surface in the banking system? Even if he was careful, even if he laundered the cash, the statistical likelihood of $194,000 in marked bills simply never appearing in the banking system over 50 years is very low. Unless he never used it at all. Unless he couldn't. Theory 3. He survived the jump, but died shortly after. This is perhaps the most haunting theory of all. Under this scenario, D.B. Cooper survived the parachute landing, injured but alive. He made it to the ground. But the conditions, the cold, the terrain, the lack of survival gear killed him within hours or days. He died in the wilderness before he could make it to civilization. The money, or most of it, stayed with him, buried under decades of forest growth, or washed into a river system. A small portion of it made its way downstream to Tennebar. His body decomposed over years in one of the most remote stretches of forest in the American Northwest, and nobody has ever walked that exact spot.
This theory satisfies both the missing body and the missing money. It is depressing. It turns D.B. Cooper from a legend into a tragedy. A man who pulled off the perfect crime and then died alone in the dark, in the rain, in the trees, with $200,000 he never got to spend. In July 2016, after 45 years, the FBI officially suspended active investigation of the D.B. Cooper case. They cited a need to redirect resources to other priorities. The case was not closed. It remains officially unsolved, but the FBI was no longer actively pursuing it.
The file was transferred to a storage facility. The evidence, the clip-on tie, the cigarette butts, the partial fingerprints went into boxes, and D.B. Cooper passed fully from the realm of open investigation into the realm of American mythology. There is a bar in Ariel, Washington, a tiny town of a few hundred people near where Cooper is believed to have jumped. Every year on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, the town holds a D.B. Cooper Days celebration. People dress up as Cooper. There are contests and beer and a general atmosphere of celebration around this man who pointed a note at a flight attendant and walked off the back of a moving aeroplane. Americans have always had a complicated relationship with certain kinds of outlaws. Jesse James, Bonnie and Clyde, and D.B. Cooper, whoever he was, fits neatly into that tradition. He didn't hurt anyone. He was polite. He was calm. He pulled off something so audacious, so precisely executed, that even the people chasing him couldn't help but be a little impressed. The flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, the one who received his note, later said he was the most courteous hijacker she could imagine. He thanked the crew. He was gentle. He was, in her words, a gentleman. A gentleman who then stepped off the back of a plane into a stormy November night and was never seen again. Was he a trained paratrooper, a career criminal, a desperate man with nothing to lose, a meticulous planner who lived to enjoy his money somewhere warm and quiet? We don't know. We may never know. And maybe that's exactly the way D.B. Cooper wanted it. Whoever he was, he got what he came for. Not just the money, the perfect disappearance.
Before you go, I want to hear your theory. Do you believe D.B. Cooper survived that jump, or did he disappear forever into the forests of the Pacific Northwest? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries, make sure to subscribe to the Mystery Archive. Every week, we uncover forgotten stories, historical mysteries, unexplained events, and the secrets history left behind. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a mystery. Until next time, history is written, mysteries remain.